I'd consider myself pretty well versed in the relationships of GOCHIUSA, whether it be the prominent ones like Rize Shero or Kokochino, or the relatively overlooked ones like Kokorize. But when I first came across this image of Chino and Shero, I was stumped. Having read the manga and with Bloom coming out, now I know the context for this image, but I didn't have those things back then, and that caused me to go into a bit of a rabbit hole, pun not intended. So let's rewind time and analyze this picture from the perspective of before that chapter was released, eh? I was dead set on wondering why it was these two characters. Obviously, it could just be that Koi wanted to draw these two characters, but what am I if not over-analytical? So with that, I started mapping out the Chino-Shero relationship. The only evidence I really found for anything that wasn't standard was a couple of one-off lines, like when they're studying at the library or when Chino is asked who she idolizes and she replies with Shero. But of course, that isn't true and we know it. Shero might be responsible, but when it comes to role models, it is shown time and time again that Chino idolizes Kokoa and even Mocha more than she does Shero. But of course, we can go deeper than that. I believe that these two are representative of the duality of man. Basically, the philosophical concept that mankind has two distinct and often opposing sides. I know I sound crazy, but hear me out. I think it's normal for characters to have contrasting qualities. Kokoa is open and friendly, while Chino is shy and reserved. But there's a literary term called a foil, where a character is both similar and different at the same time. This makes their differences stand out even more. To borrow an example from OSP, if you have a character with ice powers and a character with fire powers, their powers are opposites, yeah, but they both have elemental powers, and that makes it stand out more than if you just compared someone with ice powers to someone with no powers, even though that may seem just as opposite. And in this way, I think Chino foils Shero quite a bit, and vice versa. For example, they both have an affinity for rabbits. But while Chino loves them, Shero is terrified of them. And at the same time, rabbits avoid Chino, but Shero seems to be a magnet for them. They're deliberate opposites. Now, you might be wondering, why am I making the comparison to Chino and Shero rather than Shero and anyone else who loves rabbits? And again, it comes down to having both similarities and differences. Kokoa has a love for rabbits, which would be the opposite of Shero's horror, but only Chino has the similarity of the rabbits doing the exact opposite of what she wants. There's also the existence of their, I guess for lack of a better term, alter egos. We have Phantom Thief Lapin and Magical Girl Chino. This is another similarity shared only between the two, and I think there is another case of literary foil here. Fundamentally, the Magical Girl and the Phantom Thief can be seen as polar opposites. A Magical Girl is symbolic of Chino retaining her childlike sense of wonder, and a Phantom Thief typically has a more jaded worldview. A Magical Girl also traditionally has a strong sense of justice. Despite recent adaptations subverting this trope, the fact remains that it was a trope to subvert in the first place. On the other hand, a Phantom Thief often operates outside the law, wandering a moral gray area. Because it's GOCHIUSA, of course, it's nothing too serious, but the symbolism remains nonetheless. They also have pretty fundamentally different personalities. Chino is usually calm and collected, while Shero is louder and easily flustered. Both of them try to hide their true feelings, maybe not successfully, but for different reasons. Chino is embarrassed that opening up as much as Kokoa does might make her seem childish, while Shero is constantly scared that she'll ruin the relationship she currently has with others, specifically Rize. For evidence, I present the fact that Chino is reluctant but willing to get closer with Kokoa, while Shero is almost never taking the first step, at least on purpose. Of course, these characters are not static, and that description is mainly of Season 1 and 2 Shero and Chino. Okay, so they're opposites. So what? What is the significance of pointing out these literary parallels? Well, first of all, the point of most foils is to emphasize differences. So the point of these foils would be to emphasize that Chino is calmer yet still childish, while Shero is almost careful to a fault. But as an analysis on the duality of man, again, we can go deeper. And if we view Chino and Shero as two halves of humanity, we can analyze their interactions. But first, let's establish which two halves of humanity they represent. I think Chino and Shero, being and acting younger and older respectively, represent youth and adulthood. Chino and Shero, when studying at the library, both say that they would enjoy having the other as a sibling, Chino as the younger and Shero the older. But if Chino is the child, why is she so mature and calm while Shero is loud and flustered? Shouldn't it be the other way around? Well, I believe that's because they're representative of the phases of life, not the specific people in those phases. Childhood is often seen as simpler times, while adulthood is usually a whirlwind until you land yourself a stable job. Back to them wanting to be siblings, their opposite traits are what makes them compatible, but only to a certain extent. Being too similar or too different from someone can make it hard to form a friendship with them, but being fundamentally similar with a handful of differences can promote the best chemistry. Chino often also laments being seen as a child, and with her representing youth, it's symbolic of how a child always wants to hurry and grow up. And Shero represents the opposite. She wishes internally that the expectations on her weren't so high, getting caffeine drunk to cope with it. A worry very characteristic of an adult longing for simpler times, aka their childhood. This is a tale as old as time, with a child wanting to grow up and an adult saying, no you don't. But of course, at the end of the day, this duality is of one entity, and it's important to be both. To grow up, but also to retain just a bit of your younger self. Just like Chino and Shero are good friends, it is important for both sides of the human experience to reconcile with one another. Only with both sides of the coin are we ever truly complete.